In this video, we're going to look at the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland. Okay, so what is their function? What hormones do they produce and how are they regulated? So let's look at the thyroid gland first. Okay, where is your thyroid gland located? If you feel in your neck, you have a bump that's sticking out, that's your Adam's apple or your larynx. If you talk while you touch it, you can feel it vibrating because that's where your voice box is. Your thyroid gland is sort of around and below your voice box. The parathyroid glands, there's 4 tiny parathyroid glands located on the posterior or the backside of your thyroid. So the thyroid gland produces thyroid hormones. They are T3 and T4. That is triiodothyronine and thyroxine. And we will look at how those molecules are produced. But first, why are they produced? What stimulates the production of our thyroid hormones? Okay, do you remember the hypothalamus produces thyrotropin-releasing hormone? The hypothalamus, that hormone then stimulates the anterior pituitary. That will make thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid to make T3 and T4. Now, when does this occur? How is it regulated? Okay, the hypothalamus is regulated by negative feedback. So when thyroid hormone levels go down, the hypothalamus will be stimulated to make thyrotropin releasing hormone. So the thyroid, its general main overall function is in metabolism. So whenever we need to have ATP, our energy, we need to have more thyroid hormones. So we will also stimulate the hypothalamus when we are exercising. Okay, so exercise will stimulate, through a cascade of events, an increase in thyroid hormone production. And then also acute stress responses will increase thyroid hormones because we need energy for stress. Now, let's have a look at our thyroid anatomy. So here is our larynx, and we can see the thyroid gland is right here. It's anterior to the trachea. Okay, and you can feel your larynx and you can feel the rings of cartilage around your trachea, and your thyroid gland might feel a bit like a little marshmallow around the front of your trachea. Okay, it's a very highly vascular gland. And if we took a little cross section and looked inside, the thyroid gland has these sort of large regions called colloid, which are fluid-filled sections that are surrounded by cells. Now, the cells that surround these colloid regions, there's 2 main types. One of them is called follicular cells, and the other type, let's just shade it so it's a little different, is called parafollicular cells. Now, different hormones are made in each cell type. The follicular cells are the ones that make the T3 and the T4. Parafollicular cells make a hormone called calcitonin. And this hormone is very important for calcium regulation. We will talk about that next. So first, we will look at how the follicular cells produce T3 and T4. There are 2 minerals that are really important for thyroid hormone production. Okay, the first one is iodine. We need to have iodine in order to be able to make thyroid hormones. If you're iodine deficient, you will not be able to make thyroid hormones. The other thing is we use the amino acid tyrosine. And then the other mineral that we require is selenium. Selenium is a really important mineral for converting T4 into T3. T3 is the more active of the 2 thyroid hormones. So if you don't have selenium to convert it, you won't have enough active T3. So here we have our bloodstream, we have a follicular cell, and we have a colloid region. In the follicular cells have a nucleus with rough endoplasmic reticulum, just like other cells. In here we have our DNA, so there's genes in here, and rough endoplasmic reticulum is for synthesizing proteins. A very important protein that is produced is moved into the colloid, and that is called thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin uses the amino acid tyrosine to produce two molecules. So tyrosine, two tyrosine molecules will combine with iodine to produce a monoiodotyrosine, which has one iodine molecule, or diiodotyrosine, which has two iodine molecules. So iodine has to be consumed in the diet as an ion. It will diffuse through into the follicular cell. Now it has to be carried by a membrane transporter protein, and it is co-transported with sodium ions. Then the iodine, once it is in the follicular cell, it is transported through another membrane protein into the colloid. Now, this monoiodotyrosine and diiodotyrosine, they can be combined to produce either T3, or two of these can produce T4. So MIT and DIT, they will move back into the follicular cell through endocytosis. And once they are in the follicular cell, they are going to combine with a lysosome. Lysosomes contain digestive enzymes, and it will cleave off the thyroglobulin molecule to produce our T3 and our T4. So T3 has 1, 2, 3 iodines, and T4 has 1, 2, 3, 4 iodine molecules. Now remember that thyroid hormones, even though they are made from amines, they are fat soluble. So when a hormone is fat soluble, it can diffuse across a membrane. But in order to be transported in the blood, it will need a plasma protein to be able to travel through the blood. So we know that thyroid hormones play a very important role in metabolism, but there's a few other very key things that thyroid hormones do. So let's look at this list. Thyroid hormones regulate fat, carbohydrate, and protein metabolism. We can break down all of these nutrients to make energy. Carbohydrates in our body are stored in the liver and muscles as glycogen. Thyroid hormones tell the mitochondria to use oxygen to help us make ATP. In all cells, including the brain, so having low thyroid hormones would affect cognitive abilities like learning and thinking and being able to concentrate, as well as mood. Thyroid hormones help us metabolize vitamins. Vitamins act as coenzymes in chemical reactions. It stimulates the production of growth hormone, and it has a synergistic effect with growth hormone. So both of these combined are important for protein synthesis and for bone growth. It increases the sensitivity to catecholamines. Catecholamines are dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. They are also made from tyrosine, but only one tyrosine molecule, not two combined like thyroid hormones. We increase the production of catecholamines when we have a stress response, an autonomic sympathetic nervous system response. So when we have stress. So epinephrine, for example, increases heart rate and increases cardiac output, and thyroid hormones increase that effect. So if you had excess thyroid hormones, you would have excess effects of a stress response. So having more thyroid hormones can cause anxiety. We will look at what happens when you have too much or too little. Thyroid hormones are very important for cell differentiation and development. So during embryonic development, it helps cells to become differentiated into specialized cells like liver cells and bone cells. It has a very profound effect on brain development during fetal development. And it affects body temperature. When we produce ATP, a byproduct is heat. So when our metabolism increases, we make more heat, and that helps us regulate our body temperature. When our metabolism goes down, we might feel a bit colder, and this is why when we exercise, we feel warmer and we start to sweat. So now that you know the functions of the thyroid hormones, think about how you would feel if you had too much or too little. Okay, so when you have too much thyroid hormone, it is called hyperthyroidism. When you have too low thyroid levels, then it's hypothyroidism. So with hyperthyroidism, you're going to have symptoms like being excessively warm or heat intolerant. You're going to have an increased heart rate, increased breathing, increased cardiac output. You might have more of an appetite. You might have sleeping problems, insomnia, anxiety, irritability, those kinds of symptoms. Whereas with hypothyroidism, your metabolism is going to be lower. So you can have weight gain. You'll be fatigued. You might feel depression. You would have a difficult time concentrating, be more forgetful, not being able to focus on what you're doing. And also, with low thyroid hormones, dry, flaky skin seems to be a common side effect, and also hair loss can be related to low thyroid hormones. So the point is that we need to have a balance with every single hormone. Too much or too little will cause symptoms, and it will take you out of homeostasis. We need to have the right amount of every hormone at the right time for the physiological situation for our cells to be able to function properly. There's two autoimmune diseases that are becoming more and more prevalent in the population. So one of them is called Graves' disease. Graves' disease is an autoimmune disease where the immune system produces antibodies that bind to receptors that increase the production of thyroid hormones. So Graves' disease stimulates the production and causes hyperthyroidism. And Hashimoto's disease is an autoimmune disease as well, but the immune cells attack the thyroid cells. So there is a hypothyroidism. The other thing that I want to talk about is goiter. Goiter means that your thyroid gland is enlarged. And sometimes it's very visible, and you can see that the thyroid gland has grown, and that is called hypertrophy. So goiter can be caused by either hyper or hypothyroidism, and that seems a little bit weird, but I'm going to explain why. So the anterior pituitary gland produces thyroid stimulating hormone. TSH will stimulate the thyroid to produce thyroid hormones. And it also can stimulate growth of the thyroid gland and increase the development of follicular cells. So when the thyroid hormones are regulated, when there's thyroid hormone, it will inhibit the hypothalamus, and that will inhibit the anterior pituitary. Now, let's suppose you had hypothyroidism. Now you don't have enough T3 and T4. Now the hypothalamus is going to keep increasing thyrotropin releasing hormone, which will stimulate the pituitary to make more thyroid stimulating hormone, trying to make the thyroid produce thyroid hormones. So then that thyroid stimulating hormone will cause the thyroid gland to grow, and that's a goiter. So you can increase the thyroid gland size by having low thyroid hormones. With hyperthyroidism, when you have the increased stimulation, so say in Graves' disease where you have antibodies that are stimulating the production of thyroid hormones, that stimulation is increasing the size of the thyroid gland and you're getting more thyroid hormones. So in both cases, you can have a goiter. Now, let's switch gears and look at the parathyroid hormone, and then we'll go back to that calcitonin hormone that we talked about in the beginning. So we are now going to look at calcium regulation. Blood calcium levels need to be highly regulated because it's very important for the nervous system, for releasing neurotransmitters, and very important for the muscular system. For muscle contraction, we need calcium to move the troponin and the tropomyosin so that the muscle fibers can contract. So without calcium, you can't contract muscles, including your heart and your smooth muscles like muscles in your blood vessels. So our body very highly specifically regulates blood calcium levels. And it does that with two different hormones. So the first one is parathyroid hormone. And that is made by the parathyroid glands, and that increases blood calcium levels when blood calcium levels are low. And then calcitonin decreases blood calcium levels when blood calcium levels are too high. So they balance each other so that we can always have the right amount of blood calcium levels. So let's look at a bit more detail of how that works. This diagram is showing the posterior side of our thyroid gland, and you can see that we have these 4 parathyroid glands on the posterior side. So each of these parathyroid glands has chief cells that produce parathyroid hormone. Now, in this diagram, we are looking at how homeostasis is maintained with our blood calcium levels. Let's suppose our blood calcium levels are decreasing. That is going to stimulate the parathyroid gland. The parathyroid gland will make parathyroid hormone. Now, it is going to increase blood calcium levels, but how does it do it? It basically has 3 targets. So, number 1, it is going to target the bones because the bones are a great reservoir of calcium. In the bones, we have osteoblast cells that build bone tissue, and we have osteoclasts that break it down. So the osteoclasts will break down bone and allow minerals to go into the bloodstream. Our skeleton is a really great source of stored minerals, including phosphate and magnesium and others, but we'll focus on calcium. So when parathyroid hormone stimulates the bones, it's going to stimulate the osteoclasts. Parathyroid hormone also stimulates the kidneys. Now, the kidneys can excrete or reabsorb calcium. So parathyroid hormone will tell the kidneys to reabsorb calcium, so it stays in our body and we don't excrete it. And then the last thing is it will convert vitamin D into an active form. Vitamin D is very important because it stimulates the digestive tract to absorb calcium. So calcium is one of those minerals that we don't just absorb all the time if it's in your diet. We only absorb it if vitamin D is activated and tells the intestine to absorb calcium. So we release calcium from the bones, we tell the kidneys to reabsorb calcium, and we stimulate the production of active vitamin D so that we can absorb calcium from our small intestine, from our diet. All 3 of those things are going to cause our blood calcium levels to increase. Now, over here, let's suppose the stimulus was high blood calcium levels. Now we have too much blood calcium. Now what is going to happen? Then we will stimulate the thyroid gland. The parafollicular cells will produce calcitonin. Calcitonin has 2 primary targets. One is the bones, but now instead of stimulating the osteoclasts, it's going to inhibit the osteoclasts so that more calcium isn't going into the bloodstream. And then it will also stimulate the kidneys, and it will decrease the amount of calcium that's taken up, so more calcium will be excreted. And then we will go back into homeostasis. So parathyroid hormone will increase blood calcium, and calcitonin will decrease blood calcium. With blood calcium, if we had a vitamin D deficiency, if we were children with a vitamin D deficiency, we would not have enough calcium to build bones properly, and that can cause a disease. So a vitamin D deficiency in children can cause rickets. In adults, a vitamin D deficiency can cause osteomalacia, and that is where there's not enough bone mineralization, but bones are kind of soft. They still have collagen, which makes them sort of flexible, but they're still at an increased risk of having fractures. And then the other disease that I want to mention is osteoporosis, which can happen as we get older. So osteoporosis is also a demineralization of the bones, but the bones become brittle and more likely to fracture as well. So in order to prevent osteoporosis, we need a couple of things. Number one, we need to have calcium in our diet so that when we stimulate vitamin D to become active vitamin D, and there has to be calcium to absorb in the digestive tract. Okay, so if you're not consuming calcium, then you're not going to be able to increase your blood calcium levels. So then the calcium is just always going to come from the bones. The other thing that we need is vitamin D. So vitamin D tells the body to absorb the calcium from our diet. And then the last factor that is important for preventing osteoporosis is exercise. The bones have to be stimulated. So even if you take calcium supplements, if you're not exercising and stimulating the bones won't take up that calcium and you will just excrete it. And here is a summary chart of our thyroid hormones, parathyroid and calcitonin.